Dr. Mark Forman, and I'm excited to talk with Dr. Mark. We met through social media and through integral circles, and Mark is a psychologist in California. He's runs private practice, works with men, women, families, and children, and he's also runs a certified integral therapist training program. But where Mark and I kind of meet is we often agree on sort of socially controversial issues. So, Mark, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the AMP podcast.
Thanks for having me, Casey.
Yeah, so I wanted to get you on here and just get your views. I know you have spent a lot of time with an academic pursuit on some of these cultural and social trends that we see, and we're going to enter into some sensitive territory. There's a sort of a cultural tone right now, and I work with a lot of men, and a lot of men come with this sort of a cultural baggage and shame, and I know you do too. So let's just kind of jump in and explore some of the cultural assumptions, beliefs, statistics that can be challenging, especially for men.
Yes. Hold on to your trigger warnings, everybody. And I would actually start, as we're entering into the conversation, I'd actually start with that point. So there's this huge thing about trigger warnings, and if we bring up sensitive subjects and people are listening who have had a prior trauma or believe they have had a prior trauma, can their trauma be re-triggered? And this is where being a psychologist gives you a bit of the insider info. So when somebody comes to me or another trauma therapist who is quality at what they do, there's a lot of trauma out there in the world, but what we are trying to help people do in trauma work is separate out what really happened and to learn to feel the grief and the loss and the fear and the anger around that event, and then move on in their lives without seeing the trauma now everywhere. So if someone was abused by their father, for example, and has a fear of older men because of that, that would be a trauma. We wouldn't want that person to avoid older men. Those older men are not her father in this case, if we use that kind of story. And if we encourage her to avoid her father or avoid the triggering stimulus when that man is not threatening, he's not doing anything harmful to her, she doesn't need to set a boundary, we're actually making her trauma worse, because we're telling her your trauma is real and it's everywhere and it's never going to end. So you need to be afraid of anything that even remotely resembles your trauma. So that is the exact opposite of where we want to go, even in helping traumatized persons. It's not to say they should, dive headlong into every controversial conversation. Sometimes things can be overwhelming, but by protecting people from sensitive conversations, we're actually making their trauma worse. We're convincing them of their fear, and they then don't go on to lead empowered lives. So I think, this is really important. So for anybody listening, who may have some, charge around this issue or know somebody, we're doing nobody any favors by not talking about controversial things, such as, rape or domestic violence, etc. Does that make sense? I think it's a really important point.
I'm really glad you opened with that, because I've had this, I'm a bit of a layman, so I just have this kind of reaction, like, what do you mean trigger warning? Like, life needs a trigger warning, right? And I tend to sort of gloss over it, but while fully acknowledging, like, trauma is real, and we don't want to, like, overwhelm people all the time. But the only way to heal, in my experience, is to sort of titrate in the experience and kind of feel those feelings. So I'm glad you started with that, and trigger warning, but it sounds like you and I are both willing to stay in a relationship with people who are triggered, which I think is the way to find healing.
Yeah. And the only thing, the only real thing that we want trauma survivors to do, which sometimes they struggle with, is to be able to recognize, I am in a threatening situation and this is a real one. So if someone's been abused emotionally or physically, to be able to sense that taste when it's actually happening and, fight or flee, get themselves out of there. That's a healthy response, but that's not 99% of what happens to us.
Yeah.
So I'm good. Glad we're on the same page. So, I come to these questions, as a person, as a man growing up in, my generation, which is Generation X. So I was born in 75. So I've grown up, with the change in our gender discourse. I'm not sure that I became totally aware of it until my mid-20s. There were I grew up in a very liberal part of the East Coast, so, the gender discourse was shifting around that time, but it sort of hit full force when I came out here to the Bay Area, Berkeley, San Francisco, etc., and I just was really quite shocked with a lot of what I was hearing. I would sit through classes in graduate school, where people would just openly sort of accuse men as a group of, being sort of the only problem, and a perpetual problem, a historical problem. They're the oppressors, etc. And no one would argue back. No one would blink. I actually had a teacher in graduate school who specifically silenced all the men just so that the women could, sort of quote unquote have their voice. And I'd never seen anything like that, in my growing up in an otherwise very liberal place. And so that started to grow on me. It's in terms of, wondering. It raised a lot of questions. I started reading, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It seemed like there were some things that might be useful or, really helpful to people, but there was just a lot of accusation flying through the air. And, I was being taught to be a therapist, and to meet with real people. And, what I was being taught, was that men are the violent parties, once an abuser, always an abuser. Women are sort of, the perpetual or to be expected victim, in these situations, and sort of on and on into, larger social questions. But interestingly, one of the first couples I ever saw in my practice was the reverse of the stereotype, which was that the woman would get physical with the man when they would argue. She would throw things. Occasionally, I think she may have pulled a weapon on him or threatened him with a weapon. And this scared him to a huge degree. And he would be emotionally and verbally abusive with her, sort of in return. And she couldn't really keep up with him. He'd come from a family where they, fought and they were good at fighting with words. So it was the reverse of the stereotype. Now, if I were to have listened to my graduate education and what the cultures around me were saying, this shouldn't happen. This shouldn't be the case, but it was actually the case. And luckily, by that time, I knew enough to know that one of the most important statistics that they found, and this has really been studied over and over again in multiple, modern cultures, the rates of domestic violence in terms of who initiates violence with who are almost exactly equal. There's a very large study. It's what's called a meta-analysis, meaning you do an analysis of all the big studies, and this one was of 82 studies. They found it's essentially 50-50. And then, of course, a large percentage of the time, domestic violence is mutual. So there's a back and forth. And that actually ends up being the most dangerous kind of violence. So women initiate violence by themselves, not in self-defense, because this has been looked at, just as much as men do, or even maybe a little more. And there's a mutual component to violence, which gets very scary. And if you think about that, that makes sense. If I'm hitting you and you're hitting me, it's going to escalate. And that's where things tend to really get dangerous. Now, there is a very small group of men who are kind of the old school model, like that the sort of the feminists would want you to believe is the whole cloth. It's just part. and they're sort of they're sociopaths and they're real predators, and they kind of keep women that they're with sort of imprisoned, and they're frightening and very violent. But that ends up being one of the smallest percentages of domestic violence, and yet the entire structure of our domestic violence treatment in this country is built on that model. It's built on the idea that if there's interpersonal violence, it's a pattern. The guy is a sociopath or he's got huge problems, and we're gonna protect the woman, and that's it. Now that obviously serves some women very well, and I've had some of those women in my practice, but it doesn't serve the large majority, and it doesn't account for all of these other cases. The other thing that this has really done is that the idea had been that it's patriarchal attitudes. So it's an old school attitude that a man has a right to hit a woman. That's what is the causing factor in domestic violence. And it's not an individual issue, and it's not even a family mental health issue. And it's that. And this has been studied along with everything else because people have been looking at this question. And patriarchal attitudes do not predict domestic violence at all. As a matter of fact, it's mental health and previous family history and alcohol, which, although we talk about alcoholism a lot, we still do not make the connection between how powerful alcohol is as a precipitator of crime and all these kinds of things. And the risk factors are the same for men and women. So you put men and women in a toxic family system where people may be personality disordered or they're drinking and hitting a lot, and those are the people who are predisposed to be violent. So not only have we got it wrong in seeing that women are the only victims of domestic violence, but we've actually looked at the entirely wrong set of risk factors because we've been looking at this sort of patriarchy boogeyman, and we've been ignoring mental health, and we've been ignoring, to a large extent, the role of alcohol. So we're not helping, we're distracting, and therefore, in my mind, we're doing a poor job. Now, a small percentage of domestic violence workers know this stuff, or a subgroup, they know it, but there's a lot that don't, and unfortunately, therapists have been part of propagating this material. So anyway, that's a segue into why I care about these things, because I see them in my practice, and I see the people, and I see all the variations of who did what to whom, and it's everybody. And sometimes it's the guy who's bad, sometimes it's the woman who's bad, sometimes they're both bad at the same time, and it's hard to pick out, it's just a dynamic. But the discourse that we've had, that men are the, definitely, always, just before we get there, and that's often what happens in a domestic violence dispute. If it's mutual, the man will get arrested. Doesn't matter when. Or what the circumstances are. And that may be beginning to change just a little bit, but this is a real problem. And this is an issue why some women don't call the police on men, because even if the violence is mutual, they know he's going to prison, which is not always, what people want.
Yeah, I think.
So let me take a pause there.
Yeah, I think it's great. So if you haven't caught on already, guys, we're sort of questioning some sacred cows, including the ideas of patriarchy. We may get into rape culture. Men are violent. Men are oppressive or whatever. Like, these things just don't really bear out in terms of the science, or either Mark and I's lived anecdotal experience. I mean, I'm from the same generation, and I'll just share a little bit personally. My parents got divorced when I was young, my early teens, and my dad made some mistakes, and my mom divorced him, and so I was basically raised by my mom, and my mom was a first wave feminist, and I love her, and she's amazing. And in her day, her options were you can go to college, that's a new thing for women, but you can be a nurse, a school teacher, or a housewife. Those were basically the jobs she had available to her. And so she went school teacher, and then she eventually put herself through school for a master's degree and became a principal, and really found her power. so in terms of feminism, like I'm all for that. Like I'm all for women having opportunities in career and whatever they want to do, right? Equal opportunities. And yet it seems like feminism has progressed into something that demands equal outcome. And, it looks at things like these violence issues as if they're sort of just totally one-sided and really one-dimensional. And I find it painful as a man to live in a world where everything is reduced to the fact that I have a penis, and that's the problem. Ignoring intense, nuanced subtleties that I've just experienced in my own life. So that's what I have to say about that. I want to make it clear that I'm coming at this dialogue with you, looking for synthesis, looking for a way to feel connection about it, because my first reaction is kind of just like, well, fuck you, right? Like when someone says, I'm the patriarchy, I'm perpetrating rape culture, I'm like, I'm defensive. It's like, yeah, no, I'm not doing any of that. And, and I don't want to feel that defensiveness. I actually want to be constructive. So that's where we're at.
Yeah. That's a great, and it's very interesting. I have a similar story. I was raised by a single mother, and it was, really my father who had a host of kind of issues in his own life that were very significant. My mother was great, and she was very successful. She was a psychiatrist and the chief multiple times of her psychiatry units, and very incredibly smart, incredibly productive. And so I think one of the places to start is with kind of saying, how do we synthesize, is that there's two things. There's women's issues, which are the concerns that confront women. So things like maternity leave, things like abortion rights, things like equal access, which I think have, largely been addressed, and we can talk about that. There's women's issues, and then there's feminism, which is a way of believing about the causes or the solutions to women's issues. And if we're looking kind of for an interesting analogy, it's a little like saying Christianity has morality in it. But Christianity is one way of looking at morality. It doesn't exhaust all forms of looking at morality. So we can kind of take a critical look at Christianity and say, well, okay, that's your morality. Maybe there's some things I really agree with there, and maybe I consider myself a Christian or a type of Christian. But we can also look and say, hey, there are things in your belief system that don't ring true, that just don't match reality, and those can be a problem. So we can look critically at Christianity and say, well, what has that got to say thus far about gay rights? And we can really disagree. And so it's the same thing with feminism. We can look at it, it's a belief system. Feminists will also say, it's a very diverse belief system. And there are lots of schools of feminism. However, my argument with that is that may be true, except most of the other schools of feminism don't have much power, and they don't have much say. And it's been sort of one version of feminism, which is sometimes called gender feminism, sometimes called radical feminism. I prefer to call it dominant feminism because it has a dominating attitude, and it dominates as an active principle. It's kind of taken the field of feminism and defined it around itself. But I think one of the ways we can just start to think about this is women's issues are not feminism, and we can be very progressive. I'm very progressive. I vote progressive, and we can align with women's issues while not agreeing with the worldview. And I think that's one place where we have to form a little bit of a wedge and be able to say you can align with women's issues, and you're not trying to turn the clock backwards in time, but you don't have to buy the what's basically an ideology, and an ideology that, at least for men, does no help, in my opinion, for men and their psychological well-being, or for relationships, because I think it sets up a bad kind of it sets up kind of a hierarchy in at least heterosexual relationships, which is a problem. And then men have to kind of climb up over feminism just to get to an equal playing field. sort of in a social way, in the cultural way with their partner, because they're told you're the problem and you're literally part of the oppression of your partner. So how do you have a real honest conversation about your partner where you express your needs and you communicate to her, what isn't working for you in the relationship, and you hold her accountable? How do you climb on over all that social noise to get there? And watch out, if your partner believes that you're sort of part of the problem, and she can't be, because she's been told all her life that there's no way she could be, that's a big problem. Now, clearly women get mixed messages to a certain extent, but we've got this progressive culture where women are goddesses. They call each other goddesses. And as a psychologist, that sets my radar off. I think if men were ever calling each other gods, which we might have been, it was a problem, not a solution. And because it insulates you, it sets you up where you're on a pedestal and you can do no wrong. And that's a terrible message to send to people, because it cuts them off from their humanity. It cuts them off from being able to be here and be responsible and be connected. And it inflates your ego. So I'm really, skeptical of that, and that's become this, sort of large part of our discourse. And when I meet with couples, it's like there's no room for any of that. There's two people, they've got their dynamic. Yeah, there's definitely some masculine, feminine, polarity in a lot of cases that's interesting to discuss. But there's nobody in the room is Jesus, or nobody in the room is Mary Magdalene. You're Bob and Jane, and you've got some histories, and you want to love each other. And, you want to each own what you have to own. And, you each want to, share what you have to share, too. And it's very sweet when couples are able to get there. But this noise isn't helping.
I like that a lot. We definitely accentuate the polarities with Authentic Man program work. But the way I always hold it is like, we're just people, right? And like, we're cultivating agency, meaning like the individual's ability to express themselves in the world. And that comes on both sides, men and women. So I think we're definitely in alignment there. I just wanted to I want to get into some of these misleading statistics. I mean, you dropped one there earlier talking about violence is initiated more or less equally. And, just saying that is like, that's kind of a prickly one, right? People maybe not believe that. It kind of goes against the prevailing narrative. And, as a man, like I outweigh my wife by 100 pounds. If we both initiate violence equally, you're going to notice what I do more than you notice what she does. So, men are more effective at physical violence.
Yes, and the stats definitely bear that out. So women are, in a domestic violence situation, they're 2/3 of the ones who get seriously injured, but you'd even be surprised to know that, men are 1/3 of the ones who actually get injured. And women often in these situations, will pick up a weapon. And as one of my martial arts instructors once told me, give an 8-year-old a magic marker and tell him to cut you with it. And chances are he will, which is to say, like, weapons are the great equalizer. But we don't have to actually, here's the big point, we don't have to lie about the statistics. And that's what it's become. These have become just lies in order to see that there are disparities there. We don't have to lie to say that women are more at risk. And perhaps even the lion's shares of our resources need to go to, protecting women victims because they are more at risk. And maybe we should, extend kind of a little more immediate sympathy and, you look first, at the woman and say, how are you doing, because of the physical disparity. So there's nothing contradictory about knowing the statistics, which again have been done over and over again, and applying the appropriate care and even making distinctions to say, yeah, women are more at risk. So that's fine, but it doesn't mean we have to hold two thoughts in our head at once. Women are more at risk and more danger. Okay, we're going to point more there, but we're not going to point everything there. We're also going to say, hey, men are at risk too, in a lesser degree, we need some resources for them, and we at least need to be able to walk into a situation and say, who looks worse, and get the story, who did what to who. And, funny thing is, often people will tell you the truth. So, if I had one message to give, if somebody remembers nothing else, we shouldn't be afraid of the data. We don't have to lie in order to engineer a morality that makes us feel good. If we stick to the statistics in the areas where we really know it, those actually imply a lot of moral principles that we can get behind, and that we can feel good about, and we can say we're protecting women. So another one would be, that men are, sort of the ones who are likely to abuse children. And the truth is, it's again like 50-50. Women are pretty much just as dangerous per hour of time, to kids in terms of abuse. We can protect children, and we don't have to automatically blame the father or the mother. We can look and say, okay, what's this specific situation? So it's that very dangerous feminist idea that the personal is political, instead of the personal is personal and specific, and then maybe it's political at the end of it. It's really, we got to look specifically. So we don't have to you can tell the truth and be a moral person. Matter of fact, by knowing the truth, or as best we can get, you're going to be a more moral person, and a more moral man, because you're going to be able to look at a situation and, be open to the possibilities of who needs help, and who needs accountability, or, pushback and responsibility.
What I hear repeatedly,
yeah,
too, is that it's not so much a man-woman issue. It's a values development. It's is alcohol involved? It's economic. How
yes.
wealthy or poor are you? Like way more causative factors there than man-woman. And throwing out things like patriarchy or men or whatever, it really fails to capture the nuance, and I think gets in our way of actually solving these things or making progress towards solutions.
Yeah, and class and education play a huge role in who's likely to act out violently, even who's likely to sexually assault. These are difficult things to talk about, but it's the truth. Class, education, substance issues. Not everybody who does something bad is just, like Dexter, sort of a crazy person who popped out that way. There are forces shaping. So if we want to help, we have to look at these things. So I think, we talked about domestic violence. I really think that, there are a couple of other major issues that are in the ether that are a real problem in terms of this discourse. And this is where I think we need to kind of stand up and get accurate. I think one that maybe people are more familiar with is, the wage gap mythology. Mm-hmm. So there is a wage gap if you take all the women and you compare them to all the men, and that's the comparison you do. Women do make, 77, 78 cents for every dollar a man makes, and that's true, except when that's presented, and that's been presented by, this is not just like, lefty academics in Berkeley. The White House has been running a campaign on the wage gap. But when you actually look at how many hours a week do people work, and men work on average more hours per week, what educational background do they have? What are the professions and the majors they took? How much experience do they have? How long have they been in the job? Now, obviously, childbirthing throws a big monkey wrench in here, and it turns out that women who never have kids actually earn more than men who never have kids, and are almost exactly at equal parity with men who do have children. So when childcare doesn't get in the way, that's another big factor, and that's a big social issue. We need to talk about that, but childcare and childbearing is not anybody's fault. This isn't a conspiracy, that men created. This is our biology, and we're not at the point where we can, maybe in 200 years men can have babies, and we'll be able to monkey with our biology, but this is what we've got, so we got to talk about it. But when you factor in all those issues, everybody who looks at this seriously, left, right, or center, the wage gap disappears. And there's no wage gap due to discrimination. They can't even show definitively that any of the difference is really due to discrimination. They have anecdotes, and no doubt, there's some sexist guys out there, but they're really a minority, and that's what the data shows again and again. And so, and this importantly tracks all the way back to looking at the interests that women tend to have, regardless of their abilities. So the statistics also show women and men are equally as smart. There's no difference there. And so when we look at the choices that people make, they're making choices that have to do with how they see themselves. So when you take a group of college students and you say, well, how person-centered and emotional, kind of like emotionally connected do you want to be? Do you see yourself, etc.? In exact proportion to how people answer that question, that's where they'll go into the people professions. Men who answer the question, yeah, I see myself that way, they're going to head into teaching or therapy or, social work or whatever the case may be. Women who answer those questions those ways, they head in exact proportion and they go into those jobs. And those attitudes start, as far as we know, very, very young. Like in the 4 to 5 range. As soon as you can get people to talk, we see these broad differences and they're average differences. So that's a really important thing. We have to think a little bit, we have to think a lot in statistics. Like, just because on average women are more likely to answer that question, go into some of those professions which don't tend to pay as well, but they also tend to be easier to get into and easier to maintain. Your average, I work in Silicon Valley, and I work with a lot of people who do computer coding, and they have to update their skill set almost yearly. And they can come into work and be like, we're doing a whole other platform, and then we're going to invent another platform after that. So they have to constantly update. Whereas, teaching is a hard profession, but, more or less, history is what it was. Once you master the subject, you're pretty good to go. So there are those differences that show up just in terms of averages, but it's not everybody. So the wage gap is one. Sorry, go ahead.
Let me just reflect. I mean, so you just debunked the wage gap, which is almost mythology in at least in Western culture. I mean, everyone presumes like, oh yeah, women get paid less, and that's because men are dicks or something, And you just said no, it's not that. So I just want to kind of pause and if any feminists are still listening, they're probably pissed right now.
They're probably not.
Yeah.
It's not. And, I'm writing a long, what they call a white paper, which is basically like an academic level paper on some of these issues with a fellow named Pelle Billing, who's Swedish. And he does this kind of work and has really actually, made some very significant strides in Sweden in terms of him, getting in to talk to people in higher channels there. And they have a very similar, maybe even in some ways like a stronger feminist, bent there than here. And they did the Swedish government has looked at this forwards and backwards, and they do it repetitively in terms of what the wage differences are. There's nothing due to discrimination. It's like point something percent. So not even 10%, 5%, 3% that they can't even account for. In terms of wage differences. So that's a whole other Western culture that looks that way. And as far as I know, it's the same in every modern advanced culture. There just isn't, and it doesn't make any sense. Many people have brought this up, but if I could pay a group of women to do the exact same work just as well at 80%, I would destroy my competition.
As a capitalist and an entrepreneur, that's what I would do. I mean, if I could find a woman who wanted the job and wanted to do it for less, I would certainly hire her. I just want to give a bit of an anecdotal. I got married last year. My wife and I are trying to get pregnant, and we want to raise a healthy child, and she runs a painting business, but as soon as she gets pregnant, she's going to have to stop working in that job anyway. And I want her to nurse the child. That's like a four times a day thing. So she's not going to be able to be as high output for maybe 18 months or up to 2 years after we have a child. So that's almost 3 years she's going to be dropping in productivity. I mean, right now she makes more money than me. Like, she runs a successful business, and that's going to drop. And that's just biology, man. Like, we can't, if I could do the breastfeeding, or whatever, like, maybe I would. But what I notice as a man is, like, I'm invigorated to change, to make more money. Like, I want to grow the business. I want to, earn more, because I've got this child coming and I'm taking big responsibility for it. And she has a biological imperative to not work as much, and I can't do anything about it. And I'm just one guy, that's an N equals one, experiment. But I'm imagining that's all over the place, which would account for some of this, wage gap difference. I mean, if say my wife had 3 children, that's like 9 years of compromised productivity, while I'm actually amplifying my productivity, right? So, yeah, that's just sort of my lived experience. And when I hear these 70 cents on the dollar numbers, I'm like, like, I'm doing my best over here.
Yeah. Well, let's think there's a lot to say about this. So the first thing is, like, we could set this up, and this is often how the feminist frame does it. Like, well, she's earning less than you. Like, it's just like championship boxing, and someone's going to win. But we could also take the frame of, like, hey, you guys are married and you're a couple and you're trying to have a family together and you've got to make decisions together. And it's not a matter of her losing and you winning. Like, you make more money, that money is going to go to your family when you have children and a wife who's not working. And she's making a decision and you're making a decision to do it together. So the whole framework of feminism is a adversarial framework based on, bad case scenarios. And so we can just look at it completely differently. Like, hey, we're trying to, and this is how families tend to view it themselves, and they make these decisions. And living in Silicon Valley, I see all the variations. So I see women who are very successful, who really feel strongly, I want to stay home and raise the kids. And that's the decision I'm making. And I see that one. I see women who really value their careers and they want to go back to work. And so they're going to, take some time off usually. And then, they're going to hire a nanny. Or in certain cases, the man is going to stay home. But those are all possible decisions, and they're all okay decisions. I mean, they're all good decisions if they work for you, but we have to be honest that we're making decisions. And we want to make it easier for people to have a range of decisions, which is why I think things like maternity leave and paternity leave are important. But, there's people are making their own choices around this based on the economic pressures we face. We could have a big old conversation about changing the whole structure of the economy. Yeah, that's a good one to have, but this is the world we live in. And, couples make choices around this, and they're trade-offs. There's no way to have it all. Now, some people will say, well, woman goes back to work, and she then also has to take care of the kids. So get ready for another enormous, falsehood that's been, and so the dogma is women work a second shift and they work more than men do, even though men work more in their, jobs at work. This is not true. The data's been looked at over and over again internationally. Men and women, when you calculate the hours they work, homework, housework, work, it is exactly the same. Or like men work, 15 minutes more, or women work like 15 minutes more. There's no difference. There's no difference. This has been known, but this is an inconvenient fact because it doesn't fit the narrative that women have it worse. And there's just reams of data. Go look it up and try to find, somebody that's not an advocacy group, that's not a politically motivated group, just somebody who, whose job is to, study the data, and they'll show you there's no difference. When you look at average, now in one family, yeah, the woman might be working more and doing more schoolwork or homework and housework and childcare work. In another family, maybe the guy is pulling 80 hours a week and the woman isn't doing as much as him. And there are all these variations, but that's another big lie, that women are, put upon in this special way or in a way that's completely unique to women. When I would say, actually, we're all, there's all these areas where there's a lot more equality than there is difference, or the things we suffer are different, but they're not necessarily, it's hard to say what's better. So men earn more, but they're also 90% of people to die on the job. That's a widely known statistic. It's been studied. Men commute more. Men pull longer hours. They tend to have more stress-related health problems. They die 5 years younger. What's looking good here? I don't know. There's maybe a little bit more freedom in, some of what men do, but maybe not. Maybe there's a better quality of life in some of what women are choosing, and I think we should be honest about that.
I think you touched on this. You touched on this earlier, like the whole frame of feminism is predicated on a sort of a division, and I think patriarchy is another one. It's like it's a predication on the division, and what you just described. Feminists would say like, well, yeah, those men are doing that because the patriarchy too. It's like, but the word implies something's wrong with me as a man, and just because I'm a victim of my own flaws doesn't, it doesn't help me. Like these concepts that in their even semantics require division. I mean, this is what I want to break through. And these statistics that you're citing, controversial, but I think they do break through these like divisive frames. And, I just wanted to share another personal frame that I don't think is often addressed. So, I was single for a long time. I got married. My wife has a whole different standard for what the house needs to look like, right? Like she has this nesting instinct and beauty and decoration and all this stuff. And there's an invitation for me to help her do a lot of that stuff. And sometimes I push back. I'm like, look, if you want it to look like that, you make it look like that. I don't have some obligation to like create the nesting whatever that you want. I mean, of course, I'll help and clean up after myself. I tend to love to do the like outdoor work and stuff. So we've created a division of labor there. Mm-hmm. But I kind of draw a boundary. Like, look, if you want it to be a certain way that's way outside of what I want it to be, then you can do that. That's your project, right? I don't think that's accounted for in statistics for anywhere.
No, and I think those are, it's very funny. It's like, in order to hold the feminist view, it's a weird thing. Like the men in our family or my family, feminists might say are great. My dad was really supportive. Maybe not. Maybe sometimes, they didn't get a good one. But my brother's great. But, oh, by the way, the rest of the men are part of the oppressive, heteronormative, usually white, patriarchal, violent structure. And the division that's built into that is just so enormous, and you cannot get out from under it. You can't, you can't not be a man. You can't completely rewire your biology. So, the idea that men interrupt more, it's down to like interrupting, men spreading their legs on the train because they're taller and they don't fit as easily in the seats. But this is like an act of, territorial, male privilege. I mean, it has become a little bit unhinged, but that is, the heart of the feminist. The heart of the feminism, the reason why I say feminism doesn't have a diversity, is there's no diversity around this idea that men have always oppressed women and are still doing it. You cannot find one feminist who argues with that idea who is still in good standing with other feminists. She doesn't exist. The ones who have broken out, they're sometimes called equity feminists. They're sort of a handful, and they are pariahs in the feminist community. I mean, they get protested, they get called Nazis. I'm not making this up. And so there's no diversity of feminism, and that is just a horrible idea. What does that say about our ancestors? They were sociopaths. The men wanted to oppress, not only like the warring nation down the road, but they wanted to oppress their mothers, sisters, daughters. They woke up in the morning, they actively got together and oppressed. And that's basically the idea. And that is a morally insane idea. It's just off. And how do you live and grow out of that? And it also doesn't conform to the data, because if oppression were a cultural choice, an arbitrary choice, we would see, when we look across cultures, that the basic way that cultures were organized is very, very different across cultures, because someone's going to come, and there's a lot of cultural variation, but the basics of sort of who did what kind of work and who was expected to do what kind of roles are universal. And that's, there's no other way to account for that. In other words, if we're all hanging around in a very difficult environment where survival, is our everyday worry, enough food, that other group up the road and what they're going to do, we're going to tend to put the biggest, strongest, scariest people in charge, and those just happen to be men. We're going to look, in that certain way, and that is universal. There's actually no culture in which, it was expected that women would step into that role. Now, there are definitely figures in history where through bloodline, et cetera, women stepped into the power role. And, by the way, they often did great in that. So there's no difference, I think, in what we're talking about in terms of leadership capacity. But there was a very big difference in the way that human societies were structured, and the things we take for granted, that we can just go to Whole Foods, and that if something goes wrong, an army is going to swoop in on our behalf out of nowhere. These things are totally foreign up until a couple of hundred years ago. And that's when, by the way, things started to change, when we had the modern revolution and our whole way of making things, our level of abundance, generally speaking, the way we applied force, it all started to change. And then all of a sudden, our jobs changed. And then all of a sudden, women's cognitive capacities, which are equal to men, became incredibly important because our work started to become much more cognitive. It was less about breaking your back on the farm and, sort of breaking your back raising kids. It was more about what can you do with information. And as soon as this starts to change, our whole structure of society changes. It's not to say that feminists didn't come along early and, push in a right way, but it's just what's happening. It's not it's not a conspiracy. It's the conditions that we live in that inform how we're going to live. So this whole myth of male oppression is just, it's so pernicious, and we gotta get over it. And this is sort of like, who's listening? If people have bought this and have drank that idea, drank the Kool-Aid so deep that men are the oppressive force and women are the oppressed across all cultures, or even today, I'm not sure those people can be rescued. It's a little bit like, I'm not sure they can turn that ship around, because the indoctrination is too big, and the emotional allegiance to that idea is too big, men and women. And men argue just as hard for this as a lot of women do. And, it's really who's a feminist. But I think there's a lot of people out there, only about a quarter of people, 20%, 25% identify as feminists. And so there's a large group of people who don't have a huge dog in this fight, and who see what reality's like, kind of like you do in your family, and they look out. And what I'm really trying to do is make space for those people who are often, just nice, regular men and women, and they're not out here arguing. They're not in a professional role. They're not leading anybody, in terms of men's work or women's work, and they're not writing about this, But we've got to clear a space for those. And so what I'm trying to reach with is people who are open to a more grounded reality, men and women, and that they can then pass this information on and, change people's minds. Now, if the information changes, we find out something's incorrect, well, we can switch it up.
I'm with you. I'm with you there. A lot of the men we work with just have debilitating shame, and my job is to sort of help them liberate the shame so they can actually express themselves in the world professionally, in relationships, and in all ways. And this cultural layer of believing that something's wrong with me just because I'm a man, if we can deconstruct that a little bit, it's going to serve these guys in an individual way, I think in a big way. And I just wanted to kind of bookmark or loop back. You were talking about how typically it'd been the biggest men at the forefront of the dangerous situations and things that's totally true. And I like the story of humanity's gradual liberation from the use of coercive force as a better story than men were oppressive. I mean, humans were violently oppressing each other for millennia. We learned it from the animals. I mean, that's the sort of the state of nature is I'm going to kill you and eat you if I need to, right? And that was how humans behaved. And only with, the advent of the agrarian age did we start to be able to generate enough wealth to not have to, we actually could negotiate a little bit. Hey, I'll sell you this instead of just kill you. And that seems like the progression. It just keeps going to more and more negotiation, communication, less and less coercive violence, which is a gift, which allows smaller humans, people, women, these other people to be contributing to the abundance and the wealth of humanity. I think it's a great progression. It's a more fun story to me than men are oppressors and bad. You
can look back into chimp warfare. So chimps are one of our closest evolutionary relatives. Chimps have a form of warfare, and what do? They stalk other groups. So there's a big difference, just to name it, between in-group and out-group. So you and me, we're in a tribe together. We're kin, right? The people over on the other hill, we don't know what they're up to. They're out-group. And so we don't, and we will, humans are pretty cunning and we can be mean. We will, especially when there's resource issues. So war is driven by resources, essentially. And chimps will go and they will basically assassinate the men of another group and essentially capture, kidnap, and assimilate the women. That's what chimp warfare looks like. And right there we have a model for how men, suffer and how women suffer. So women, in a kind of more ultimate sense are, at the risk of rape in warfare. That's probably their most dangerous position, although of course they get killed, but that's sort of where things tend to lead. Men are at risk of getting killed. And so that goes down to our animal roots, and people will say, well, that's just, whatever. No, it's science. And we got to make peace with science, if we want to be on the right side of global warming, or any kind of these issues. We can't cherry pick what the science says. We are we did evolve from animals. We have to be able to look at that, and science kind of has a way of setting you free. So even something like, gay rights, one big thing that we found out is that, same-sex sexual activity shows up in all kinds of animal populations. It's not just some, cultural invention of human beings. So weirdly, when we can go with the science in a lot of ways, it doesn't mean we can't question it, but when there's a lot of evidence, we got to go in that way. I think, one more thing I want to address, because it's so up now, and it kind of the wage gap, domestic violence, the oppression, men's oppression. But I think the other issue that's really out there is rape, and rape culture. And I want to sort of just give people a little information about what's going on with that. Yeah,
that's where I was going to go next. Yeah. So thank you. I want to get at the 1 in 5 stat.
Yeah. So people should know, and I'm looking right now at the Bureau of Justice statistics, and these are the people who do the most in-depth crime research, not just reported crimes, but they talk to people, 90,000, 100,000 people a year or more. Very high response rates, meaning 90% of the people agree to talk, and they ask them very detailed questions about have you been raped, and they do incident reports. They do all these things. They look at all kinds of different crimes outside of homicide, I think. And the number of rapes from 1995 has declined from, and this statistic we're going to try to unpack a little bit, 5 per thousand to 2 per thousand in the last 15 years, which tracks with this enormous decrease, for reasons people don't know why, in violent crime overall in the society, despite the economic problems. So you'd think, if you were kind of just listening, that rape is becoming more and more of a terrible problem in terms of numbers and stuff. It's actually getting significantly less. But why don't we hear about that? And why aren't we looking at that? I think because it would break this narrative around rape and rape culture. In terms of the 1 in 5 statistic, so this is going to get a little wonky, so I apologize, but basically there are 2 kinds of surveys that people do. There was what's called health surveys. And in health surveys, what they do is they sort of take a smaller portion of people, they ask them a bunch of questions about sexual assault or forced sex, but the questions tend to be very, very vague. And they don't ever ask people really, were you raped, or did you experience an attempted rape? They sort of will say, did you have sex that was facilitated by alcohol, for instance? Or did you have sex where you feel like you were coerced? And so what they do is they kind of throw out a lot of vague questions. They define what rape is, and then the statistic that pops out of that is 1 in 4, 1 in 5. And in one of the original studies that they did of this, that really sort of blew this up in the culture, was a study by a woman named Mary Koss in Miss Magazine. She asked the questions in these ways, and 70% of the people who she defined as saying that they were raped didn't agree that they were raped. They didn't actually say it. She defined it. And particularly the alcohol or drug, and we're not talking about Bill Cosby here, so everybody's got that idea in their mind. I have no reason to doubt that Bill Cosby is a serial predator based on the number and the accuracy and the consistency of all that reporting. He's clearly drugging women and they're blackout drunk while he's assaulting them, raping them. But we're not saying, the question isn't, were you given a date rape drug, were you blackout drunk, and somebody sexually assaulted you? It's, did you have sex under the influence of drug and alcohol? And that is often counted as rape, and that makes up a large percentage. When you don't do the public health methodology and you use the crime methodology, which is to say, you tell people, we're talking about crimes here, and we want you to tell us if you've been raped or sexually assaulted. We're going to interview you. If you say yes, we're going to follow up and do an incident report. And this is the Bureau of Justice statistics. These people have been doing this, forever. And and they come up with rates of rape that are so much lower. So they did a study. They compiled all their studies, 1995 to 2013. The number of rapes per 1,000 people, or attempted rapes, was basically 4 in 1,000. That's the number. And then you add sort of sexual assault, that gets up to 7 in 1,000. Now, if you magnify that over the lifetime, people disagree, but we're now looking closer to like 1 in 20 or 1 in 50 women who get raped. Now, that's as the saying goes, and I think it's true, any more than one rape is too many rapes, any more than one murder is too many murders. But the difference between 1 in 20 and 1 in 50, and then 1 in 5 or 4 that comes out of this sort of advocacy research, which is sometimes done by the government. So there's a way to get confused there, that the government has taken on these methods, is such an enormous difference. And the other thing is the research has been done. Most rapes, let's call this sort of the Bill Cosby effect, although he's clearly, sort of an outlier perpetrator in the sense of the number of people he's raped or sexually assaulted. But the majority of rapes are perpetrated by the same person multiple times. So there's a serial predator effect. So not only is the overall level of rape so much lower than is being reported, and oh, by the way, it's lower on campus than it is off campus. So you'd think that colleges were especially dangerous for women. They're not, compared to being a student out of that age outside is actually slightly more dangerous. But not only are the numbers lower, but the people who perpetrate are lower, are a special group, and they do it again and again. And this one I'm gonna lay into because I really want to say this. There are a lot of people out there, men's work people, I'm not going to name names, who will sit there and tell you that if men don't deal with their sexuality, it's going to become violent. They really will say that. Men have to channel their sexuality or it's going to become violent. Oh, by the way, 1 in 5 women, 1 in 4 women are raped. So get a handle on your sexuality so you don't perpetrate the violence. And to that, I want to say, oh man, well, I won't say what I want to say. I won't put it in the language I want to use, but it is to me, how's the word disgusting? Because basically what you're saying to a young boy or a young man is that your sexuality is inherently dangerous, and we need to get that under control so you don't sexually assault somebody. And oh, by the way, 95% of men will never sexually assault somebody, and most of the sexual assaults will be perpetrated by a small percentage. 95% of men never going to have a problem. And it's not because they don't have opportunities, because most rapes happen with people we know. It's because most men's sexuality is fine. It is fine. It is not dangerous. You know, there's work to be done. We can deepen in our sexuality. We can go from a less mature to a more mature. But we need to stop it with this. To me, this is a kind of evil. It's no better. It's exactly the same as saying, well, rates of crime in the African American community are higher than whatever in this statistic. So, oh, by the way, all black men are dangerous. Right. And you've got to answer for all the other black men. You've got to be representative. You've got to watch out for them because that's the new thing. You got to look over the shoulder of your buddy so he doesn't rape somebody, basically. That's what it's come down to. And you wonder why men come in with shame. Now, a certain amount of shame is human, and it's part of our growth, and it's, normal in a way, but there's this whole thing. So if I were to say that, like another big take-home is, don't believe it. Look into the research. Look into your own life. There are 100 people listening. Maybe some people have done some bad things, but 95 of you have never had the impulse to rape, and are never going to do it. You're never even going to come close, you're not going to. Yeah. So I just think like we gotta take that pressure off of men, and we gotta stop scaring the hell out of women too. By the way, because it's not good for them to hear this message that any guy who walks down the street, you can take care and you can be watchful, and if you're in what feels like a dangerous situation, please, take action or ask for help. But boy, oh boy, it doesn't do women any favors to hear that there's this epidemic when it's going down, and it's not an epidemic. Just one more kind of thing to hold on to. If 1 in 4, 1 in 5 college students, this was not pointed out by me, this was pointed out by a woman critical of this, if 1 or 4 or 1 or 5 college students was really raped, then basically what we've got is progressive parents, for real, think about this, sending their daughters to rape mills. Like, if you told me that my son had a 1 in 4 or 5 chance of getting brutally assaulted at his college, 20% chance, and I'm going to send him to that college? Whoa, no way. I'm not putting my kid in that situation. So somebody is not telling the truth. Either we have one of the worst crime epidemics in history at the college level, or somebody is seriously fudging the numbers for political purposes. And, what does the research say? The numbers are being fudged. What is the political advocacy wins? Where are they blowing? They're blowing towards this is, an issue that gets people up in arms and it gets money flowing, and it pushes a button that we like to push because we like to feel like, we're protecting women. It's a basic kind of human instinct. But oh wow, do we have to do it do we have to do it with so much falsehood, and do we have to do it at the expense of boys? And does that help women? Nope. We deliver to women men who have deep shame around their sexuality, who are not going to be able to be comfortable with themselves, and then it's not going to get taken out on women in a violent way, but it's just going to become a harder thing, in relationships for men to feel comfortable with their sexuality, for women to feel comfortable. And then these are our educated folks, so they're going to go around teaching this to everybody else. So this is a huge one. We have to get down to what looks like the real issues, and we can still do good work. We can look for those serial predators. We can see, and they often do use alcohol to facilitate, much more than roofies or what you've ever heard of. So we can do a good job, and we can focus our resources, and we can focus. Rape is a very hard crime to prosecute. If we could take some of the money out of teaching every man that they're a potential rapist and putting them through sort of mandatory trainings, and we could take that and maybe put it into crime and put it into, testing these rape kits and things that police departments are too overwhelmed to do, don't have the resources, we might do a much better job in protecting women, which I think ought to be our goal. It's not feeling good, it's doing good at the end of the day, if we really care about people. So that was a soapbox, but this issue's become bigger, and I'm really passionate about it because I see so many, even who I consider, pretty evolved men, just want to buy into this and just want to throw other men under the bus as, potentially sexually dangerous. And that is, it's bad news.
I'm with you, Mark. I mean, another sort of anecdotal share is that, I went to school at Oklahoma University, which is, if there is rape culture in the world, like, that would be where it would be. And I was in a fraternity. I was in a fraternity house, and there's, crass, crude behavior and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, you didn't see the kind of sociopathic behavior that it would require to produce a number like 20% of women sexually assaulted. It just wasn't happening, And I mean, I was like living with these guys, and there was shady stuff on all sides. Kids are doing weird shit, they're drinking too much or whatever. But it just doesn't add up. And like what we've done with this is infantilize female sexuality and their ability to set boundaries and their ability to actually mean no, or we assume they're setting a clear boundary and the men are just brutal sociopaths. Like, I mean, it takes the actual like back alley rape. It takes a sociopath. I mean, you have to be a brutal individual, and those are out there. I'm not saying they're not. But there's no fucking way 20% of college students are that, like it's not that.
No.
And
it would be, and we shared a little bit about this before. I grew up in a liberal East Coast place, but I hung around with blue collar guys. I played football, I did martial arts and boxing. I mean, these were regular guys. There was if any one of them had said, that they had raped somebody, they are, they probably would have got the crap beaten out of them for real. It just, it would have been seen as one of the worst things you could do, and they would be out of the group. And it was the same thing. It's like, if you're going to hear about, this is what I did to some woman, force myself on her, I was in the context where you would hear it. Guys are relaxed, they talk, these are some of your macho guys stereotypically. They're the ones who are supposed to be dangerous. No, they talked about their girlfriends. They struggled with, they definitely, had arguments and they had troubles and they had the questions that everybody did, but they loved the women that they were with. They were human. I'm sure they made mistakes and messed up and you would hear about them, but they just were regular guys. And that's another thing, is like this sort of, we throw regular guys under the bus. Those of us who are, doing all this progressive work, it's like, oh, well, we're enlightened and they're not. No, they're not doing this either. You know what I mean? Or if they are, it's a small group and it's a smaller percentage overall, but it's not the regular guys. Regular guys are just regular guys. They want to be in love and they value having their families and they work hard to try to feed their families and try to do right by them. And they've got a lot of room to grow, and so do we. So you can always evolve. But normal guys they're good guys. I've seen hundreds of men in my practice. A lot of them are just regular, dudes off the street. They work whatever they work, and they're good guys. They try hard. They make mistakes. They have places to grow, but there's nothing wrong with who they are as men. That's just where they're at. They're not dangerous, and that's so. My pull is for everybody, and then I think if we can see it that way, we're going to improve the way women and men relate. And by the way, women are great too. I work with a lot of female clients. They're awesome. There are some of them who have, some screws loose and they've got some real problems or even some real violent tendencies, but it's a small percentage. Most women are just human beings and they're trying to work it out, and they're good folks. And I hear about the nitty-gritty of their lives. I hear those stories that people don't hear. So, I kind of know a lot about more than the average person about what goes on. And, if that would be my message, people are good and they try hard and they try to do their best. And if you've got somebody dangerous or really off in front of you, pretty soon you're going to know it. Because they stand out. They're very odd. They're unusual, and the patterns start to show. We can be on the lookout for, those people, but we can't. If we go looking for those people everywhere, we've lost touch with something, pretty basic.
I totally agree, Mark. I mean, I work with hundreds of guys with AMP, and I see the same thing. I mean, these are humans, men and women, just trying to do our best. And I'm happy that you're out there working with people. I'm also happy that you're willing to take a risk and take a stand for some of these erroneous cultural beliefs that are actually causing more harm than they're solving any problems. I want to honor your time. We've been on this call for over an hour. And I think we could talk for another 3 or 4 hours. But I think we've gone after a couple sacred cows, and you're welcome to come back anytime. I know you're doing a debate coming up at the Integral Theory Conference, kind of on these lines. You want to say a little bit about that, and then maybe tell us where we can reach you if guys want to follow up or learn, get more from you.
Sure, absolutely. So, in the community that we're both part of, the Integral community, we have kind of an academic conference and sort of a conference for, professionals who are working, with people to come. And we're going to have, we've had several debates about gender, but we've never had this question really of looking what's called the men's rights movement or men's rights activists, etc. And, the basic topic is whether we need men's rights advocates to help us sort of eventually get to a synthesized place in how we view gender. And, my argument is basically going to be, we've had, 40 years of, a pretty powerful feminism. There are 400 to 500 women's studies departments in the West, meaning, academic institutions that have these departments that look at women's issues. That's fine. We don't have one that looks at it, specifically from a male perspective. And we really need that a community to come out and to take a stand so we can get some of this information out there so that then we can start to balance. But we can't skip that step. We need to take this step. It's uncomfortable. It's not pleasant to have your beliefs challenged, basically, for most of us. But that's the only way kind of to go forward. And that's what the debate. So I'm going to debate with another fellow who's, going to represent, that men's rights advocates are often, incorrect in such and such ways. And I would say, yeah, they're probably going to be incorrect in some ways, but they're bringing a lot of this data. So a lot of the things I'm telling you come out or influenced by men's rights advocates who are and some of the most powerful men's rights advocates are women. Probably the second most famous, well-known men's rights advocate is a woman named Karen Strawn. You can look her up on Google. She's amazing. And, she's one of the ones who's really bringing some of this critique. So I think this is a really important step. And then, then we're in a dialogue, and then we've got some equal footing. And then, I trust we're going to work it out and get to a place where everybody's needs are being met, more men and women. And, it's men's sort of turn. I was talking with one of my friends, the old line goes, women and children first. And, there's a way in which modernity and, women's rights and children's rights have come online in a particular way, and their issues are looked at very carefully. It's now time for men to go. The space is open and the time is right, and we can, take a look at men's issues. I think it's, the kind of coast is clear, and some of us have got to stand up and, risk putting our necks out a little bit so that we can clear the way for other people. For people who want to follow up and are interested in my work, you can go to drmarkforman.com. That's my website for my practice. And you can also go to CIT Integral, which is spelled how it sounds. And that's my training site. And you can follow what I'm up to via those two channels.
Great. We'll put those in the show notes for you guys. authenticmanprogram.com/21 is the show URL for this episode. Dr. Mark, thank you so much for your time. It's been elucidating. It feels good to have some academic backing for my more intuitive hunches. And I love that both of us are really genuinely working towards a synthesis that is going to be good for humanity. So thank you for fighting the good fight. And let me know how I can support you in the future, and we'd love to have you back on anytime.
Great. Total pleasure, Casey. Really appreciate it.
All right. Talk soon.
Okay.